Thank you for showing up so early this morning. It is my job now to convince you that it was a good idea. That is no small task. We're going to talk about John Newton. I feel like John Newton would want me to begin by pointing out the obvious fact that he is the least educated of the theologians in this series. In fact, he's not even a theologian. How he wiggled his way into this series, I'm not quite sure. And I would like to tell you that of all the speakers that you're going to hear this weekend, I am by far the least educated of those men as well. So Newton and I make a rather ragtag team here. Somehow we got in the door, and we're going to take advantage of it. So let's open with prayer, and then we're going to look at the life of John Newton. Dear Heavenly Father, you are the God of ragtag men and women whom you choose to use in this world. And I want to thank you for this man, John Newton, and for his precious 1,000 letters that he left behind, his legacy. What a profoundly insightful pastor you raised up. A deeply flawed man, yes, but he was a wretch redeemed by sovereign grace. We thank you for his life. We thank you for these editors, and for Justin Taylor and for Steve Nichols. Thank you for their vision in this book series. And thank you for all the friends that we have at Crossway making books, not for wealth or fame, but to magnify you. May your son be more precious to us at the end of this day than he was to us at the start of it. It's in his name we pray. Amen. He was the best pastor I have ever seen. He was the best pastor I have ever seen. Those are the words of Timothy Keller in a sermon right before he quoted the words of John Newton. And throughout his preaching ministry in Manhattan, which began in 1989, Tim Keller has frequently cited Newton by name in his sermons. In fact, Newton is the fourth most referenced historical Christian figure in the sermons of Tim Keller, only behind Lewis, Edwards, and Luther. This 18th century rebel turned slave trader turned pastor turned abolitionist has profoundly shaped him and Kathy Keller into who they are today. Kathy Keller, in a 2013 interview, was asked, "What single book has most profoundly shaped your ministry?" And she said, "The Letters of John Newton, mostly the collection published under the name Utterance of the Heart, or Cardiphonia. Nothing is more insightful about dealing with people and pastoral issues. Tim and I take people through them whenever we're able. In fact, we're doing so right now with different groups." End quote. I once asked Tim Keller to explain to me why he thought Newton's letters had such a deep influence on him and his wife, and this is what he told me, quote, "John Newton was not known for his stirring preaching. His sermons are actually fairly stodgy and pedestrian." That's true. They're not very good. However, his letters in which he dealt with a wide variety of pastoral issues are pure gold. Newton was able to take the great theological doctrines of the faith and apply them to the needs of his friends, parishioners, and even strangers who wrote for his advice. In his letters, he is often blunt, yet always tender. He is remarkably humble and open about his flaws, but never in a cloying or self-absorbed manner. He is therefore able to point others to the grace of Christ, on which he himself depends. Reading one of Newton's letters is like taking a hike along some path between high walls of rock or foliage that suddenly affords breathtaking views. In the midst of addressing some commonplace condition, usually with realistic detail, Newton will suddenly, almost as an aside, toss in several lines that blaze with glory. Decades of constantly rereading the letters have taught me how to do better analysis of underlying motives, so that when the high doctrines of grace are preached and applied, they do not merely press the heart, but change the heart. End quote. Many ingredients have produced the ministry of Tim and Kathy Keller, and one of the most significant factors is the letter writing of John Newton and his applied theology to the Christian life. For the remainder of our time this morning, I want to introduce you to the life of John Newton. No matter how we look at Newton's theology or his pastoral ministry or his letter writing, his entire ministry orients around his life story, around his autobiography. And that story begins on July 24th, 1725. July 24th, 1725, John Newton is born in London. He would be raised in Liverpool, the busiest and wealthiest port in Europe due to the transatlantic slave industry. Newton's birthday, however, is celebrated on August 4th because in 1750, the British government decided to side with Rome and change the calendar so that Europe sort of matched the same calendar. And so they had to move all the dates before 1750 forward 11 days. So if you're a historian around like 1750 and you see a date, you've got to figure out like, okay, do I need to add 11 days onto this or what? And even if you go to Wikipedia today, it'll say John Newton was born on July 24th, which is technically true, but he always celebrated his birthday on August 4th. It's confusing. We don't know a lot about his childhood. We know that when he was 7, his mother, Elizabeth, passed away. She was 27. She was a devout Christian, and John's dad was emotionally distant and religiously passive, and he was a sailor. At the age of 10 in 1735, John Newton's dad decided he had had enough education, and so at age 10, John Newton becomes a sailor with his dad, and he learns the ropes. Fast forwarding to when he turns 17, he meets a girl by the name of Polly. Polly is 13, he's 17, and the moment he sees Polly, he knows this is going to be my wife one day. He falls madly in love with Polly. But at the age of 18, in the spring of 1744, deeply in love, but also a troublemaker, a very troubled troublemaker, John Newton is press-ganged into naval service. He is physically kidnapped and forced into military service, and he is made to serve on the Harwich, which is a naval ship in the Royal Army. On the Harwich, he's going to get a taste of naval warfare. He is also going to make war on all of his superiors. He hates authority. He hates all authorities over him. He will constantly reject and resist anyone above him. And so the leaders on the Harwich are not too happy with him. Newton tries to desert the ship, and he's caught in the act, and he's given corporal lashings that he would never forget. You talk about a whooping that you'll never forget. He got one of lashings that he will never forget, which only made him more angry and more rebellious towards his superiors. The Navy is going to rid themselves of him forever at the age of 19. They're going to trade him to a merchant ship for some sailors on the merchant ship that they could use on the naval ship. So Newton is booted off of the naval ship, and he begins work on a merchant ship called the Harwich at the age of 19. That ship brings him to Sierra Leone in West Africa. Newton would eventually leave that ship and essentially be forced to work on land in Sierra Leone, overseeing a holding cell for slaves who had been captured and who are now being readied for the Middle Passage from West Africa to the Caribbean islands and to North America. Here he experiences what he will call his African slavery. He becomes the object of scorn and is severely mistreated by a woman who's over him, who is a black woman, an African princess, who mistreats him in severe ways. In a turn of wicked irony, for 18 months, Newton will be a slave. He will be physically and emotionally abused to the point of death. It is said that he became the pity of the slaves around him, who call this his African slavery. He turns 22 while he's trapped in Africa in these horrible conditions. He's 4,200 miles away from Polly. He hasn't seen her for years. He escapes this torture long enough to get a note onto another ship that can be taken back to his father to say, hey, come and save me. This is the condition. This is where I'm at. Come and get me. His father gets word. He immediately sends a cargo ship to go get his son John. And it's the Greyhound. The Greyhound becomes then the most notable ship in the story of John Newton because the ship that's supposed to come and save him becomes even more distressing for him. He gets on the Greyhound. They're going back to England. And on March 21st, 1747, becomes the turning point, the most significant date in the life of John Newton. On the Greyhound, they get hit by a massive storm that just busts this ship to pieces, breaks the mast off, fills the hull with water, and it is battered. The only reason the ship does not sink is that it is not a slaving ship. It is a cargo ship full of beeswax and lumber. And the hull is full of wax and lumber, and for that reason alone, it stays afloat. And they get it into the port of Italy on April 8th. At this point, Newton is not converted. This will happen about 18 months later, but the shipwreck itself is a major turning point in the awakening of John Newton, because out at sea on the raging ocean, he stood on the deck and was hand pumping water out of the hole, and as he looked down at the swirling abyss, all he could see was eternal judgment, and he knew that he deserved eternal judgment. And what he saw in the ocean that night was a glimpse of the eternal hell that he deserved. It would not convert him, but it would change him forever. He would become a seeker from this point on. He desperately needs the gospel, and he needs financial stability so he can get married. Now, those are kind of the two things that become the driving emphases of his life. Between the age of 23 and 30 in England, and with no pangs of conscience whatsoever, Newton will make 4 separate slave ship voyages from England to West Africa, then to the Caribbean, to North America, back to England. Four separate occasions. All of this in shipping slaves from Africa to the Americas. In 1748 and 1749, he is the first mate on the Brownlow, which is a ship that's gone for 69 weeks. What's interesting about his first slave ship run is that he docks in Charleston. I don't know how many of you have done like a historical tour of Charleston and seen the circular church. Anybody here seen the circular church? You can go and see it today. Well, Newton's boat takes a stop in Charleston for 3 weeks. He unloads 150 slaves into the slave mart, and for 3 weeks he's going to the circular church to hear sermons because he desperately wants to close with Christ, as the Puritans would say. He wants to not only be a seeker, he wants to know that he is saved. And he's in Charleston for 3 weeks, goes to the circular church, and apparently does not hear enough about the gospel to actually be converted. That'll come later in the story, but it's interesting. If you go to Charleston, you can actually go to the circular church, which I believe is the only standing building that Newton had ever entered in North America that still stands to this day. Shortly later, he would be saved. He would hear the gospel from another ship captain, and start a lifelong relationship with a man that became his best friend and mentor over the years. But finally, in 1750, at the age of 25, John Newton marries his sweetheart, Polly. There's more to be said about that relationship a little bit later, but not long after the wedding, John's father drowns in a swimming accident. It is one of the curiosities of the age that you didn't really need to swim to be a sailor. In fact, most sailors couldn't swim. I don't understand how that works. I would think if you applied to be a sailor, one of the first questions would be, can you swim? Apparently not. That was not one of the questions that was high on the list. If you fell in the ocean, that was pretty much it. The same year of his marriage and his dad's passing, Newton takes his first voyage to Africa as a captain of a slave ship. The Duke of Argyle is the name of the ship. It's a 47-week voyage. In 1752, he leads his second voyage to Africa as a captain of a brand new ship called the African. It was a 59-week voyage. And then in 1753, he leads a third voyage to Africa as a captain of a slaving ship that was a 34-week voyage on the African as well. I pass over the names of these ships and these voyages very fast, but each of these ships represent a hull full of God's image bearers, treated worse than pigs. African slaves terrified of the ocean, severed from their families, fearing the future. Many of them believed that they were going to be eaten by cannibals for food. They had no idea what was happening to them. They were severed from their family. They feared the future. Men, women, and boys herded and pushed on board and stuffed into shallow holes of a cargo ship, laid on their backs, face up, on bare wood floors, stuffed tight, side by side, unclothed. In Newton's own words later, they were compressed, quote, like books upon a shelf. And I have known them so close that the shelf would not easily contain one more. 3 groups, men, women, boys, separated and clustered. For profit's sake, every flat space in the hole was covered with naked bodies. For insurgency's sake, every one of them chained to his or her neighbor by wrist shackle and ankle iron, fastened tight for a 2-month journey to slosh around in salt water and human waste until 15 to 33% of them died of disease. At that point, were unchained and thrown into the ocean. By morning, John Newton did his devotions. By day, John Newton stuffed slaves into cargo ships. And by night, John Newton wrote romantic letters to his wife. I have to wrestle with that. Back home, just after his 29th birthday, out of the blue, John Newton's life will take a drastic turn when he suffers an epileptic seizure that will end his seafaring career. And that's all he's known for 20 years, and that's over. He's unemployed for 10 months, has no work, doesn't know what he's going to do. Educated until the age of 10, sailing for 20 years. What is he going to do? Permanently marooned on dry land, he redeems the time. He meets several times with George Whitefield. George Whitefield becomes a friend of his. It's unclear what they're talking about, but clearly Newton is starting to get inclinations towards ministry. In the meantime, in 1755, Newton takes a job as a senior customs official back in Liverpool. Liverpool, again, is the busiest and wealthiest slave ship harbor in England because of the slaving industry. With his position, he gets he becomes essentially a tax collector at the gate of the Liverpool harbor. This job will provide him a decent check, it will provide him leisure time, and it will give him the free time he needs to read theology, to teach himself Greek and Hebrew, and to continue to make connections with Christian leaders and preachers. His network continues to grow. In 1757, Newton becomes friends with John Wesley. Wesley, again, keeps feeding this desire Newton has inside for ministry. And on his 33rd birthday, John Newton will stoop down to his knees and commit to the Lord the rest of his life to full-time pastoral work. And with his resume, how fast do you think he's going to get a job? Well, a couple months later, he applies to the Church of England, December of 1758. He applies to the church. They look at his resume, 10 years of education, 20 years on the sea, and he is very quickly denied. Newton is devastated. He feels he's called, but he's not deterred. He would persist and leverage his network of friends inside and outside of the ministry until finally, at the age of almost 39, John Newton is ordained into the Church of England 5 years and 9 months after he committed his life to the ministry. 39, he begins pastoral work. I hope that's a comfort to some of you who think like God's timing is too slow and you want to be in ministry and you see the vision God has for you and you want to run towards it. And God's saying, eventually. 39 years old, he begins pastoral work. The Newtons are assigned to the village of Olney, which is 60 miles north of London. There they begin the first pastorate. Think Detroit on a small scale. This was a tough manufacturing town, an overworked population of alcoholics who struggled with depression and even suicide. It was not glamorous, but it was a pastorate, and Newton took it and he ran with it. Now, at this point, you have to remember Newton's life story, as dramatic as it is to this point, is a secret to the world, right? He's just a rookie vicar trying to make his way in a small town. But as Newton was awaiting his ordination, he had a friend of his ask for the story of John Newton. Tell me your story in letter form. And so Newton took up his pen, and in 13 letters, he wrote a memoir and gave it to his friend. That friend read those letters, was amazed by the story, passed it on to another friend and to another friend and to another friend, and at some point, the 18th century version of Justin Taylor found copies of those letters, made a publishing deal with him, and John Newton's autobiography was published under the title An Authentic Narrative. Newton's testimony, chronicled now on paper, became an instant bestseller. It ripped through 6 editions in 5 months. And this little town of Olney is stunned. Newton becomes a celebrity pastor overnight. He walks down the street and he can feel eyes on him. People just stop in the streets and stare at him as he walks by. And he says to himself, I wonder why I don't wonder at myself as much as they wonder at me. Always thinking of why is he not more amazed at grace, at the grace of God in his life than other people are. He becomes a celebrity pastor. In 1767, he first meets the Wilberforce family. He gets to know William Wilberforce, who is 8 years old when they meet. Newton is 40. William Wilberforce is 8 when they first meet. That year, he befriends William Cowper, a poet, and they begin writing hymns together. In 1769, he publishes his next book. It was called A Review of Ecclesiastical History. It was part 1 of a multi-volume church history he started when he was a customs official, and he had the time to do more scholarly research. It was a very respectable book. It did not sell very well, but it does show that Newton had some academic chops in him if it could be cultivated. But it was very clear that he will not be able to write the other volumes in this church history because he was a very busy pastor, and that was what God had called him to do, and that is what would take all of his time. In around 1771, Newton and Cowper began writing a compilation project of hymns, which would be called the Only Hymns. And during this time, at the age of 47, Newton shows up one day to his congregation, January 1st, 1773. It's a New Year's Day service. I think it was a Friday, January 1st, 1773. And he introduces to his congregation a hymn, which he titled Faith's Review and Expectation. Faith's Review, look back on the previous year, and Faith's Expectation, looking forward to the next year. It's a great New Year's Day hymn to introduce to your congregation. We now call that hymn Amazing Grace. But it was delivered on January 1st, 1773 to a little church in Olney. So much can be said about that hymn. It's 85% single-syllable words. 85% single-syllable words. A perfect illustration of how Newton believed you can do profound ministry with simple language. And it seems like when you read the story of Newton, every time there's some amazing thing that happens in his life, tragedy comes a month later. He gets married to Polly, dad drowns. He releases what's going to become the most famous English hymn in the universe, and that night, his friend, William Cowper, is going to try to take his own life. William Cowper was deeply depressed. He attempted suicide that very night with a self-inflicted knife cut, followed by an outbreak of hysteria, and he nearly bled to death. Descriptions of the scene look like something you would see in a horror film. Blood everywhere, wall, ceiling. Newton, the night he unleashes the hymn Amazing Grace, he's at his friend's bedside late at night, making sure he doesn't bleed to death. Unreal. In every victory, Newton was met with new suffering. His age was one of suffering. It's really hard for us to wrap our minds around this right now. One historian of Newton's age said this. He said, life was pre-analgesic. There was no Advil. It was pre-antiseptic. There's no Purell to kill germs. And it was pre-anesthetic. There was no sedatives. People hurt all the time. It's hard to get back into that age. What was life like for them? The constant suffering. Speaking of suffering, his precious wife Polly faced endless medical care for conditions which we don't have ample evidence or documents to know exactly what she struggled with, but it was lifelong medical struggles. It seems safe to assume that she was infertile and the Newtons would never have children of their own. They would adopt 2 daughters. Both of them were orphaned nieces. Betsy, who was adopted at age 5, and then Elizabeth, who was adopted at age 12. Elizabeth would die 2 years later, at the age of 14. In 1779, the only hymns were finally finished and published. Newton had to take on the lion's share of the work to get it completed. And later that year, weary of Olney and all of the trouble that he did face as pastoring a very needy congregation, feeling burnout, Newton was offered a new pastorate at St. Mary Woolnoth's, I think you say that, St. Mary Woolnoth in London, which he takes. At the age of 54, he becomes the rector of the church, which essentially is at the heart of the financial district in London. In effect, moving from small-scale Detroit to Wall Street. For all the years of pastoring, even before pastoring, Newton has been writing and publishing dozens of pastoral letters. Some anonymously in evangelistic magazines, and many of his letters are written privately to friends and strangers who have questions for him. Again, he's a networker. Hannah Moore is going to send him lots of questions, and he's going to respond to her. He just has this growing network of friends by post. And when I say letters, think blogs, not email. We think of letters today as kind of like email, one-to-one communication. Letters in this day was really social media. It was blogging. Cheap and dependable postal services were now possible. In England, you could ship letters all over the place. One historian says you could ship a letter from one side of England to the other side of England faster in 1750 than you can today. So it was very quick. I don't know what that says about the post office today, but the postal service was dependable, it was cheap, and an informal form of English communication was now widely used. So you didn't have to speak in an elevated language. You could use more of a street language in letters. Both of those things made letters very popular. Letters became communal things meant to be read by entire households. So you would get a letter from someone, you would read it out loud, you would pass it around. That's how letters worked. They were the social media of Newton's day. He mastered the medium, and he knew he mastered the medium. There's ample evidence to show that Newton knew, okay, my sermons aren't very good. I can't preach like Whitefield. He loved to preach extemporaneously, which is a bad idea. Just don't ever do that. And he couldn't pull it off. And he knew that he wasn't going to be known for his children's legacy. He wasn't going to have children. There were a lot of things he knew he wasn't going to have, but he knew he had mastered the art of letter writing. At the age of 60, Newton begins mentoring William Wilberforce, who is now 26 years old. Newton famously encourages Wilberforce into politics, despite he was a very good theologian, and he was a good pastor. He was a good preacher. William Wilberforce. He's written some Christian living books. You could write a William Wilberforce on the Christian life. I mean, he wrote that much on Christian living. He was very competent pastorally and theologically. But Newton says, go into politics. There's an opportunity for you to make a difference in politics. And I would say that John Newton's counsel when it comes to politics has kept me sane in these last 2 years. And I know readers who have sent me emails saying, thank God for John Newton's view of politics. It has kept me sane. Newton essentially believed if God has given you the skill and the opportunity to make a change in the political system of your country, go for it. Glorify God in Washington, D.C. And if God has not called you to Washington, D.C., vote and pray for your country and leave it at that. Now, there's some social involvement that he will get into, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but there is in Newton a very clear paradigm for political involvement that I think is worth listening to today. Newton despises preachers who take politics into the pulpit. He hates it, and he will tell preachers that his entire life. Do not preach politics in the pulpit. But on the matter of slavery, he feels a growing need to speak for the cause of justice, and he will preach 2 sermons on abolition. He will preach 2 sermons, and then he's going to write a pamphlet. At the age of 62, in January of 1788, Newton lends his voice to the abolitionists and publishes a pamphlet titled Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. He undersells the title, Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. Newton's anti-slavery views go public for the first time. This is 34 years after his final voyage is ended. Newton returned home from his final venture, and 34 years later, he writes this pamphlet against the slaving industry. From the opening page, the weight of Newton's personal regret is obvious. He writes this: "If my testimony should not be necessary or serviceable, yet perhaps I am bound in conscience to shame myself by public confession, which, however sincere, comes too late to prevent or to repair the misery and the mischief to which I have formerly been accessory. I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. I have written simply from a conviction that the share I have formerly had in the trade binds me in conscience to throw what light I am able upon the subject now that it is likely to become a point of parliamentary investigation. I am not afraid of offending many by declaring the truth against a commerce so iniquitous, so cruel, so oppressive, so destructive as the African slave trade." That's page 1 of the pamphlet. And oh, what light would Newton bear? Newton brings to this conversation a tonnage of eyewitness reports and details that are unequaled. He is a notorious diary keeper. One of Newton's biographers will go so far as to say this: Newton's diaries, letters, and logbooks provide one of history's most authentic eyewitness accounts of the mid-18th century slave trade in all its gruesome details. Newton puts not all of the gory details, but he puts enough of the gory details in this pamphlet, and it gets sent out to every British MP. Newton is soon invited to give verbal testimony to the Select Committee of the House of Commons on the African slave trade and its brutality. He accepts. And here Newton will unburden himself of the most graphic testimony, and he will, without reserve, recount the barbaric butchery shown to the slaves that he has seen and heard witnessed accounts of, things that he could not muster to say from the pulpit, things he could not say in his pamphlet. And he will, from the pulpit, from the pamphlet, and before Parliament, he will deliver a death blow to the slave industry from which it will not recover. Amazing work. At home, Polly is dying of cancer. Her health was failing fast, and she would die of cancer not long after he appears before Parliament. Time does not allow us to dive into their incredibly sweet marriage, but the depth of their love and romance can be evidenced in the fact that it inspired 2 400-page novels. Not many marriages inspire 2 400-page novels. In 1961, Grace Irwin wrote Servant of Slaves, a biographical novel of John Newton. And then in 2016, Jody Headland published a book titled Newton and Polly, a novel of amazing grace. After reading Grace Irwin's fantastic 1961 novel, and it's really good, Grace Irwin, Servant of Slaves, you want to get that one, that's so good. 1961, English professor Clyde Kilby read that book to endorse it. Here's what he said in his endorsement. It's a rhetorical question. Is there anywhere a more beautiful love story than that of John and Polly Newton? It's that beautiful. This is top shelf romance stuff. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The loss of his beloved wife will be his greatest trial. He will live as a widower for the remaining 17 years of his life. He told a friend once that not a single day passed without him thinking of his wife. That's 6,200 consecutive days. At the age of 81, Newton preached his final sermon at St. Mary Woolnoth, ending 27 years of service there. Even with a late start at the age of 39, his pastoral ministry will span 42 years and 5 months. In February of 1807, Newton is now confined to bed and nearly blind, but he learns of the passing of the Act of Abolition of the Atlantic slave trade by a vote of 283 to 16. Big win. It was a long time coming. This would not end slavery, but it was a major victory that would cut off the intercontinental flow of slaves from Africa to the Caribbean islands and to America. So the British could no longer do that shipping. So it cut off the artery that was feeding slaves into the States. It was a big win. Much more work is going to be left for abolitionists to come after. And a few months later, about 8 p.m. on December 21st, 1807, at the age of 82, John Newton entered into the presence of Christ. Just a few weeks before his death, John Newton uttered his final recorded words to a friend. He said this. He said, "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things: that I am a great sinner, and that Christ is a great Savior." The life of John Newton is stuffed with all the intrigue and adventure and horror that you would need to write a 400-page novel or to produce an 8-hour miniseries of his life. He was a squandered youth. He squandered his youth. He was a defiant soul, a rebel. He had a heart in love with the world and yet captured by the love of his life. He had a near death on the seas. He had a radical conversion. He had a life of suffering, regret over his past, great labors as an abolitionist that he embraced, and a famous hymn that nearly everyone who speaks English can sing by heart. But in between the drama was a lot of quiet space. Filled in those quiet moments by Newton, with pen in hand, was about 1,000 letters of the pastoral nature, theologically robust, 1,000 letters that would later be published. Of Newton's generation of evangelicals, J.I. Packer once wrote this: "As the Lord Jesus Christ crucified and reigning was the life-giving focus of the evangelical revival, and as George Whitefield was its supreme awakener, and John Wesley its brilliant discipler, so ex-slave trader John Newton was its peerless pastoral counselor and perhaps the greatest Christian letter writer of all time." Yes, John Newton was a ragtag man. Worse, as he would willingly say, he was the chief of sinners, and he was not ashamed to say that. He was the chief of sinners. Only the sovereign grace of his Savior could break his chains and save a wretch like him. What amazing grace produced was perhaps the greatest pastoral letter writer of all time, and it's in those letters. Don't forget the letters. Be amazed by the biography. Be amazed by the highlights, the drama, but don't miss those 1,000 letters, because he is perhaps the greatest pastoral letter writer of all time. And it's in those letters that you find the kind of influence that has the power to shape a ministry like Tim and Kathy Keller's. Thank you.